Awesome. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending our talk, our little virtual presentation, and thank you so much for allowing us to share something that we think is pretty cool with all of you.
Yes. For anonymity purposes of our client, we're going to be talking a little bit about someone we're going to call Executive A and Project X. Let's talk a bit about Executive A. So Executive A is one of the most well-connected people and successful people you'll meet. He was one of the founding members of insert Fortune 500 company here. And he has an idea. It's an idea for an app that in his mind is going to change the world. His idea was to bring networks and skills closer together. He had a particular issue, in fact. His issue was that despite how many people he knew, and despite how large his network was, when his wife had a brain tumor, he couldn't find a surgeon in the place he happened to be in who he could trust or who he knew. And where he was, the health system wasn't so great. And when you have a brain tumor, you actually can't take a flight. So he needed someone to come to him or find someone nearby. And he couldn't do this. So he had this grand idea he was going to create an app for this. So Executive A puts together a team. He's very involved in the process. He's talking to investors every day, getting funding, getting feedback, using it, showing it off, demoing it as it develops through its lifetime. And despite that, when he was launching it to users, the users couldn't figure out how to use it. No matter, the more he started speaking to the actual users of the application, he realized he'd made a grand mistake. He'd mistaken himself as a user of the app. In fact, his target demographic he was actually trying to sell it to was not, he was not the user, essentially. And so this made him take a big step back and say, okay, clearly we've done something wrong. We need to stop and pause and do something different. I've come to understand that UX is a field we should be paying attention to. And that's when he called up myself and Chantelle and said, okay, I need to not make the same mistake again. I need to know my users as much as possible. And that's when we came up with this concept of building data-driven personas. Over to you, Chantelle.
Cool. So thanks, Jade. So yes, as Jade mentioned, this app that was created about 3 years down the line, when they actually started speaking to their users, they started noticing that users weren't finding this useful. So the question was, what would users find useful, and how can we then cater for that? So basically what the mission was, and kind of what led to this whole thing, was they wanted to create a web version of Project X, and this was going to be more focused on being a workplace communication and productivity tool. But basically the idea was that we would take like the features and the concept of Project X and apply that to a web version and add like the niche of being a workplace communication and productivity tool. But the problem was that people had absolutely no idea how to use Project X, but even worse, they didn't even know what value it will add to their lives, and they didn't really know what the use would be of using this thing. And obviously with this problem came the realization that we cannot just take the features of Project X app and apply that to a web platform, because we would then be facing the exact same problems that we were facing currently. So we really needed to, in a very short amount of time, figure out what the real problems were that people were facing, and how we can tweak and redo some of our features in order to actually solve real problems and be valuable to users. So basically, a quick overview of our process, and as we go along, we'll obviously go into a lot more detail on each of these steps. But the entire process lasted about 2 to 3 weeks. We started with first coming up with survey questions and sending out that survey, and then processing that survey data that we gathered, and then interpreting some of the clusters a lot of these things will make a lot more sense as we explain each of these steps. But basically, after step 4, we kind of realized that we left out some really, really important questions, and we had even more questions. So we kind of reworked the survey and sent it out again and did steps 1 through 4 again. And then I created like our persona template. I conducted interviews. I finished up the personas. And then we presented our findings to the client. Even though that's at step 8, the client was kind of along the entire ride, involved in some spaces, and we were reporting back to him in between these steps. But that's just basically a basic overview of our process. But before I go into too much detail on the process, I just want to touch on the conventional persona. Most of you might know or probably know what it is, but if you don't, a persona is basically a description of a fictitious person that represents the target users. And the reason why we use them is it's kind of a means to house user data in a more human way that evokes empathy, and it can be used as an easy reference to the user's problems that you're trying to solve in brainstorming and ideation sessions. So this is why we chose this as kind of like the means to house the data that we gather. But currently, personas are pretty much under fire because oftentimes they are created based on assumptions and not real user data. And this could be because of the rushed nature of creating them in a real-world environment where time and resources are restricted. And I just want to repeat that this Project X, it was for a startup where time and resources are even more restricted. And this basically it results in having biased personas, or personas that are very stereotypical, and it doesn't really communicate what the real problems are, it communicates what we think the problems are. So how we try to be better is to create personas that are based on real user data, but our idea was to mitigate the time and resource restrictions that we had through using machine learning to fast track processing the quantitative user data that we collected. So starting on our personas, so we kind of framed our questions in a certain way because we wanted to learn certain things. We wanted to learn what the demographics were of our target users. We wanted to gauge workplace behavior because this would be a workplace communication tool. We wanted to know kind of how people made decisions in their work life, what were their personal and work-life balance, how people interacted with their colleagues on communication sites. Also, whether people felt uncomfortable or overwhelmed using other workplace tools, because that was something we found in our initial desktop research. So we wanted to gauge a bit more about that. And this is just a few of the things we wanted to learn. Obviously, there are a few more things, but this is the basic things that we just wanted to get a good overview of our users in terms of the workplace, as well as communicating with colleagues in the workplace. I'm going to hand over to Jade to explain how she went about sorting through that survey data.
So I don't come from a UX background. I come from a machine learning background. And one of the cool things in machine learning is a technique called unsupervised learning. Sorry, I have to, the problem with sharing a screen is I have to indicate to Chantelle when to change the slide. This is my signal. Oh, you can't see me, so I'll just say next slide. So unsupervised learning is a type of machine learning which is used to discover unknown patterns in data. Now, if you've got a lot of surveys, so 100 results, 1,000 results, 10,000 results, it depends on who you're doing the survey with, we could probably summarize that by looking at averages. We can summarize that by looking at distributions. But what it doesn't tell us is kind of these patterns. It just gives us a very summative view of it. Go to the next slide. And so what we want to do is use unsupervised learning to kind of help us uncover this inherent structure. A really fun example of this is this particular one where they created an image map that maps the relationship between emojis on Instagram. This is not a human who's gone and done this. What they did is they automatically used one of these unsupervised techniques to kind of highlight the inherent structure of the data. What they did is they looked at where these the words that these emojis co-code with, and ones where they were used in similar contexts are thus brought closer together. Next slide. So here you can see, like, if we zoom in a little bit, you can see all the frightened and scared emojis are together, all the holiday-related ones are together, the sports one are together, and the happy faces are sort of together. And once again, there is no human coming in and deciding where these go. There's an algorithm that tries to highlight this structure for us. So the particular technique we're using is one called clustering. And the basic premise behind clustering is that that we have groups in our data. That's the idea. There are groups that we're trying to uncover. So what we do is we take our data points and we assign them to different clusters. And the goal is to make these clusters as close as possible. The one we used is a particular one called k-means, but I won't go into too much detail on that. You can jump to the next slide. And one of the key things is that when people have been assigned to a cluster, we get this candidate, this centroid, they call it in the machine learning world. But essentially, it's a candidate that represents everyone who fits into that cluster. The goal being that everyone who's in a cluster shares some sort of attributes with each other. And this helps us, it's quite simple if we're looking at this 2D example. This would perhaps be if you had 2 questions you were asking people. But now imagine if you had many data points, or many dimensions per se. So we had 50 questions. We can't really map that out in a 2D graph. So having something we could say, hey, these are the 10 centroids or the 5 centroids, the 5 representative candidates from your data can be quite helpful. So this is what we used with our survey data. And this is quite overwhelming, so I'm going to help guide through, and we'll do a bit of a zoom in next. And for each of these, you can see each row, that is a particular question that was asked. Each column is the cluster. And the graph within each of those is the distribution of the answers to give us a very full picture. Typically, what you could do, instead of giving this full distribution, you could say, only show the most answered one for each of those kind of question dimensions. But we wanted to get a very full picture, so that's why we plotted them on this little graph. If you go to the zoomed in view, here you can see this is our particular demographic, or the particular company we were looking at were a group of software engineers. Here you can see in more detail what is going into each cluster. So as an example, in the first cluster, you can see that there are a lot of intermediate staff, whereas in the third cluster, we can see that there are a lot of junior staff. That would be in the first row. And the second one kind of asked if you were a firefighter, a manager, or a builder. And the last row asked if you wanted, which one did you want to be, a builder, a firefighter, or a manager? These were a couple of roles that had come up before. And you can see there's a cluster where people who are firefighters actually want to be builders. There's a cluster where people who are builders and they're happy being builders. There's a cluster where people are builders and would like to be managers. And from this, we can kind of build up this full picture of who is fitting into these clusters. So in order to figure out some of the most impactful questions, because we asked a lot of questions, and not all of them will necessarily assign a person to a cluster. Some of them are not. Some answers aren't as informative. We can try and look at the correlation between the questions and which cluster they ended up in. So here is a particular graph where you can see the more pink something is, shows you that dimension contributed the most, or was one of the dimensions that contributed the most for that person, resulting in a cluster. Typically, it's a combination of dimensions that results in a cluster. We ran these for each of the clusters.
Cool. So touching on then how I created the different personas. So basically what happened was that Jade provided me with those graphs that communicated the different clusters of users that we had. And then I took each of those clusters and I created a persona based off of that. Not a complete persona yet, but I kind of created a persona template and I transferred all of that data and the groups into each persona. And what made this really great was that we were able to, because personas sometimes can be quite reductive, a lot of the times they portray people as these single-minded entities that have this one problem that they experience all of the time, and this is who they are. But like we already know, people and humans are actually quite complex, and the way they experience a particular problem can change based on circumstance. The way they make decisions can be based on circumstance, especially if you're looking at if you're targeting users in their workplace, where a lot of different things can happen, both expected and not expected. So the reason why I chose to create these different graphs is to not just say, okay, these people, all of the people in this cluster are currently firefighters and they want to be builders. But there's actually a subset of people who are builders and are happy to stay that way. Some people are managers, because there's a lot more to human beings than just this single thing that they're struggling with. So this is kind of why I really liked this approach. As you can also see in the demographics section on the right, this is not just a male white senior guy. This cluster is 30% male and 17% female, 15% other and 21% rather not say, as well as 39% white, 6% black, and 21% Indian. So we're really able to add a lot more depth to the different personas that, because what I wanted to combat is the fact that personas can be quite reductive. But basically, there were still things missing after this first round of gathering quantitative data and sorting through that, because we had our different user groups, we had the patterns, and we had the overall picture, but we were basically still missing context. We were missing the why. And if I were to go and add the context just out of my head, once again, these personas would have been biased according to what I think. So the next step for me was to do interviews with people. It was the same group of people that we did the surveys with. And basically what I wanted to learn was why we were seeing these patterns emerge in the clusters. Obviously, when you do one round of research, it opens up a whole new set of unanswered questions that you might have. And I also wanted to probe for more specifics on the problems that people face in the workplace and exactly how that affected their productivity. Because just looking at numbers, you can't always gauge these things. And the way I approach this, because obviously now you're interviewing people, but you need to know where to house the qualitative data you're gathering from them. So the way I went about this was Jade mentioned that she was able to know like which of the different survey questions were more influential in placing someone in a particular cluster. So there were, I think, about 3 questions that I repeated from the survey in the interviews in order to be able to place the people I'm interviewing into the different persona clusters. And this allowed me to add a lot more depth to the personas. And I included all of the qualitative data to supplement the quantitative data. It allowed me to add things like goals and motivations of the persona type, and any unanswered questions they have in terms of the tools they're currently working with, any frustrations, and if they have any workarounds with those frustrations currently, any reasons why they return to using communication tools, even if they might have problems with them. And on the right, you can see one of the personas in its entirety. We had about 6 of them. So through doing this, we were able to create a really good picture of each persona type that we had. And we had a lot of things that we can work from when ideating and seeing how we can kind of transform Project X that wasn't that valuable to users and hopefully create something that is really valuable and solves real problems. So in terms of our reflections, there's obviously a lot of things that we would have done differently. Some things we found particularly cool, some things to look out for when maybe you want to do it. So first of all, why we think this was pretty cool was firstly, it saved us a lot of time. And we were able to create personas that are based on data and facts for the most part and not our own assumptions. And above all, Jade got to learn some UXy things. I got to learn some machine learning things. And it was really a great collaborative effort to bring our 2 fields together in order to be a bit more user-centered when trying to be better than what we were when creating Project X's app.
More specifically on the unsupervised learning part, it's quite a dark art of machine learning. It's, determining how many clusters. It's not obvious. We have to kind of play around and get a very good hang on the data. Clusterings. It's hard to know when a clustering is bad, regardless of how, every data point ends up in a cluster, even if it's not necessarily always a good fit. Which clustering algorithm, and like as I said, your outliers get assigned to clusters, so it's important to try identify them. And each time you run a clustering, there's kind of an element of randomness, so you might end up with a slightly different result.
Then in terms of personas, as I mentioned before, personas are inherently quite reductive because they do not look at an entire person. They use the area of focus or domain you are working within as a lens to highlight the relevant attitudes and specific contexts associated. So a lot of the times personas can leave out some contextual information that actually influences the problems and the stuff communicated in the persona itself. So that's just something to also look out for and be aware of when creating your own personas. And from this is you, Jade.
And from the clustering perspective, I would have done a lot more analysis of the clusters themselves in terms of how good quality they are and do kind of this extra outlier detection, which I mentioned before. So your outliers are obviously very important in that your outliers should not necessarily be dismissed. They represent their own potential cluster.
And in terms from a design perspective, stuff I would have done differently is even before creating our survey questions, to kind of have an exercise with the entire team who were involved in this so that we can first surface all of our assumptions, because obviously the Project X app was built off of a bunch of assumptions. So firstly, to surface all of our assumptions and being aware then of confirmation bias so that when you're doing your research, you're not just going out there to try and confirm what you think you already know, but actually try to go on a new path and try to discover things that you don't already know. And also just when presenting like these findings that you have to clients, to not bombard them with problems, but rather empower them with insights. So taking your findings and not going about it in look at all of these different new problems that I identified, because that can be quite overwhelming in terms of, geez, now we need to solve all of these new problems, but rather showing them how the new problems that you identified can actually what we already have, just with tweaking it a bit, could actually also solve these problems and not having to create something entirely new, which can be quite overwhelming. And yeah, that's basically us. Thank you so much for listening. One thing I like to say is now go out there and create software that are both awesome and usable for a wide range of different humans. We can now go over to questions. I think I'm going to stop sharing so that I can also see the questions in the chat. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. So the first question is, it's from Dion. Interested to know how this played out in the customer experience of Project X.
Sorry, can you just repeat that? I was trying to not share my screen anymore.
Sure. The question is from Dion, and the question reads, is interested to know how this played out in the customer experience of Project X.
So that's a good question. So this is pretty much a bit of a sore topic. The reason why I had that other insight at the ending of showering your clients with insights and not problems is because a lot of the things we found out was a bit overwhelming, and it was basically, this whole thing was very much time boxed. So we didn't use as much as I wanted from this research to inform our new decision making, which is a bit of a pity. I would have loved a lot more to have been used, but yeah, that's the best answer I can give you. I'm sorry.
That's all good. Thank you. The next question, that's from Samantha. What happens when the data does not make sense, or you don't have what you feel to be enough data? What backup plan do you have?
That too is a good question. So when you don't have enough data, what is enough? When you don't have what you think is enough data, then you can probably do these detailed quantitative interviews with each person you do have data on. The point of this is to try to find a way, in a scaled way, to limit the group. Ideally, you should be, if you're worried about representation, then your main goal should be to strive to get more and more surveys. And as with anything, the more data you have, the more of a representative sample you have. When the data doesn't make sense, that can be due to a number of things. Often it's to do with the way the question was worded. So going back to the survey and ensuring that there was no ambiguity in the data, sometimes contacting some of the survey people who did the survey and ask them if they had any problems with any of their questions, or they were forced into buckets, or they weren't the right options. Sometimes when it doesn't make sense, I suppose then there's the idea that the context from which you're asking doesn't make sense, or that the actual problem you're trying to solve doesn't make sense. Yeah, that's my answer on that. If Chantelle has anything she wants to add there.
Yeah, just in terms of what you constitute as not having enough data, this is pretty much quite a sore topic, because a lot of people think that they need hundreds and hundreds of data points in order for the data you're gathering to be useful. Having a small quantity of really valuable data is also a really good thing to have. Yeah, because that can also do a lot to at least give you a starting point, and maybe starting to solve some real problems. Yeah.
I'm going to add one more question, and this is from Monet. Hopefully you saw the project through from persona creation to delivery. How much did the persona change since creation until when you delivered the project app website to the users or customers?
So unfortunately, I didn't stay on the project until the ending. So I'm pretty sure the personas haven't changed or anything like that. Obviously, I don't have any insight into the project anymore. But like I mentioned before, the personas weren't really used as much as I wanted them to, in terms of informing our decisions. And I'm pretty sure that if we actually made a lot of use for them, because I do know that personas need to change because your users and your environment also changes, and some of the problems you're solving might also change. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm not on that project anymore.
Okay. We've got time for another question, and this is from Lizette. How do you ensure you ask the right questions right at the beginning with the surveys?
So I think Jade will also tell you this was like creating survey questions is really, really hard. I think what really helps is if you really surface all of your assumptions at the beginning so that you know, because obviously there are certain things that you think you already know and you kind of want to confirm that. But I think it's really good to also push yourself when creating survey questions to also try and uncover the unknown. But that is also a very hard thing, because how do you formulate questions for stuff you don't already know? It's still something that I'm trying to learn. So if anyone wants to also teach me, I would be open to anyone's wisdom in regards to this. But yeah, in terms of this particular survey, as I mentioned, we kind of needed to send out the second one because we made a few mistakes on the first one. But I think maybe surveys and research, just like everything else, should be iterative, so you learn as you go. But it's really good to at least send out the first one, because you then learn a lot of new things and have a lot of new unanswered questions, and then you can kind of start to gauge things that you don't already know. Yeah.
To follow on that, I think taking a approach of writing up your assumptions, turning those into hypotheses, and driving questions from those hypotheses, so that when you get the answer to that, you can say, that confirms or denies our hypothesis. So that is helpful. But yeah, the pilot study of saying, let's just have a small group, a focus group of users where we iterate on the survey and then sending it out more widely, that is probably the best way to do it.
Thank you.